Good afternoon. My name is Marc Cruder. I'm a retired Coast Guard commander, and the connection that I have to the accident is that I did a 20 years active duty with a focused career in marine inspection. Then I worked on the outside for a little bit in the industry, and then I came back to the Coast Guard as a civilian. If you've read the book, there's a traveling inspector in there. Well, there's a small staff that started in 1914 under the Steamboat Inspection Service, and I was a traveling inspector for over 20 years. I'm familiar with wood boats, sailboats, but the most important thing is in the mid-90s, I was one of the interim project managers for the revision to Subchapter T, the small passenger vessel regulations, and that was the first major revision since the 1958 regulations that were put in place after this accident. So in the files at headquarters, I mean, I was aware of this vessel. I've been on the Victory Chimes. So in the files at headquarters, there was a lot of information about the Marvel that's probably all gone, right? But, and there's a difference between how we do the regulatory process like in the 1990s and how they did it in 1958. If you read some of the revision stuff from the 1990s, it names boat names and casualties and accidents specifically. If you go to the Federal Register in 1956 and 57, it's not as descriptive. So the Levin J Marvel is never mentioned by name, and the rulemaking process wasn't in progress at the time of this accident, but boy, this put the icing on the cake and really pushed it forward. So that's my background is just a little unique. I'm retired now, but I read the book, and usually the Coast Guard, in a book on the casualties, it's usually an emotional diatribe and description of survivors. I think Kathy went right down the middle. She used I always tell people read the Coast Guard report, which is available online. It's in the public domain, but that gives you both sides. But she came right down the middle, and it was actually a happy ending. She talked about Coast Guard safety and why, you know, the way I look at it is if you go out on an inspected vessel and you pay your money, you should make it back to the dock. That's the end of it. It's a small expectation, but there's been lots of different casualties. So that's my connection to this, and Bill's going to moderate us.
I'm Dale Rausch, and I'm here in Solomons. I have a slightly different resume. I grew up here in Annapolis. I grew up on the bay, learned to sail, learned to run power boats. I worked at Fawcett's. I went to worked with Jerry Wood in Annapolis Boat Rentals, Annapolis Sailing School. I went to St. Mary's College and sailing in the dinghy program. And then somehow in 1976, I enlisted in the Coast Guard. And I went to Officer Candidate School in 1981 and spent a good bit of my time in New Orleans as a Marine inspector, obviously, and an investigator. And then I did such a good job there that they made me a captain and sent me to Guam, and I was the officer in charge of marine inspection in Guam for a while too. So I've had a lot of inspection experience, not as much as Mark in the development of laws and regulations and so forth, but I've responded and investigated a lot of marine casualties. And I think our purpose here is to show there's a link between what happens in an accident and a marine casualty and how we investigate it, how it eventually comes around and turns out to be into a law or just regulations that exist now so that we take care of problems as they really appear and correct things that needs to be done in the regulations to save lives.
Yeah, as Mark said, the process back in those days was still being developed, basically. They didn't have a standard procedure of how to get from accidents to rulemaking to law, and, that whole process. You have to remember the times. This was not that far after World War II. Coast Guard was really preoccupied with the Merchant Marine and licensing of the Merchant Marine and merchant ships and that sort of thing. And civilians didn't own a lot of boats. They didn't have the money. The war was over. And when Herman Nust decided to do the Marvel, the reason he got the idea was to they started having what they called dude ranches out west, where somebody got the great idea, hey, we can have people come out here on vacation and learn about horses and ride horses, and we'll call it a dude ranch, and you can become a dude. And so he came up with the idea of doing it in ships, and particularly, Chesapeake Bay offers itself to go on a dude cruise, learn how to sail. And one of the things Meckling and all of them did was when they brought you on board, they said, now you're going to sail like you did 100 years ago, and you're all going to help do the rigging, you're going to help pull the sails, you're going to help do everything, you're going to help steer the boat and so forth, and you're going to be part of it. And that's what everybody liked. It was that, as somebody mentioned earlier, the get-together. Oh, it was John, and the first night around the table, you kind of got to know each other, and by the second and third day, everybody was friends, and it was really a good time to be had. But so, if you could, Mark, kind of go through the difference of what it takes to get from an accident through the investigations, through Congress, through rulemaking, or does the Coast Guard have the authority themselves to set the rules, or do they need to get congressional approval, or what is that? How's that process work?
Well, I think they do have to get approval to go forward with a rulemaking. So if at any one time, if you ask the Coast Guard what's on the regulatory docket, it would be a long list. But then the Coast Guard has to decide how many resources they have and where they draw that line. So it doesn't surprise me that it took a few years, even though they had legislation ready to go. And, as you said, I don't think anybody was looking at a wood boat, much less a sailboat. There was the accidents in 1951 with party fishing boats, one in Montauk and one someplace else. And looking at how the inspection program ran, everybody has to remember the Coast Guard doesn't get inspection until temporarily during World War II and permanently after the war. But those guys, they were from the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation, they were what I would call big iron boat guys, right? I mean, I started out in the Coast Guard in the Marine Inspection Program as a boiler inspector, right? Everything was steam. And if you go back in the regulatory history, it's all about the development of steam and boilers blowing up, but blowing up on passenger vessels, right? So it's the whole connection all the time is that the level of safety that's required is a difference if you're just moving freight around. But as soon as there's passengers, even the Act of 1838, which is the first act, that was legislated, it was about passenger carrying vessels. So this happened. You have this, when I talked about the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation inspectors, they weren't wood boat guys, they weren't sailboat guys. So even though there was a traveling inspector in the story, I'm not sure how many wood boats they looked at. They weren't really looking at that.
Well,
right?
as we mentioned last night, and you brought up, during this summer I was on, and also in the previous times, the Coast Guard had actually was concerned enough about it. They couldn't do anything, but they were concerned enough about the Marvel that they sent a couple officers over in civilian clothes under the guise that they were interested in taking a cruise, and could they take a look through the ship and whatnot. And I escorted one through as a commander. turned out to be at the trial. All of a sudden, this commander in 3 stripes is called to the stand. And
Now he has a uniform.
I said to John, that guy looks familiar. I know him from somewhere. I think he came and he was looking to take a cruise, you know.
Well, so that's another interesting issue, just the methodology, right? I think that's why Judge Katz took the case over, right? Because he felt that that John Meckling wasn't getting a square deal. And I mean, I can remember when I was an investigator, maybe in the 80s, you know, we had some illegal passenger operations, but the strategy was to go down in civilian clothes or kind of do a sting operation, you know, and you know, that doesn't always work out. And the other thing I will say is, well, I mean, look, I spent a lot of time on one investigation one time, and in the end, the judge said, I think the captain of the boat said, well, my lawyer told me that this was legal. And, you know, it's not, but I mean, we proved the point, but nothing came out of that.
Yeah, it's kind of like a unwarranted search or something like that.
Right,
you know,
so-
because the victim in this situation would have been the boat and the captain, and he had no idea that.
Well, it was a surprise when they saw us all in front of the judge, right? Like you said, right?
Yeah.
Then we had uniforms.
Well, in that particular case, that commander, as I said, Judge Katz asked him if when he went through the ship, if he did, he said, well, it was obvious there was an awful lot of rot in the ship, and he said, well, how did you know that? And did you have an ice pick? Did you pick in the wood, or that sort of thing? And he said, no. He said, I've just been doing this. I have years of experience. I can look at a piece of wood and tell whether it's good or not. And there was a piece of wood that's over on the exhibit table. And so Katz goes over and he picks it up and brings it over and puts it in front of him and said, well, look at this piece of wood. Is this a good piece of wood or not? Well, of course, this commander thought he wasn't going to put a bad piece of wood in front of him, you know, and show that the ship had rot in it. But at any rate, he said, and the guy looked at it and he said, no. He said, that's pretty obvious looking at it. It's a pretty good piece of wood. And he said, it is. And he turned it over and the whole inside of it was rotted out. So he kind of negated his testimony a little
Right,
bit.
and in defense of the traveling inspector, since I'd been one, he should have asked it for in his hand. That's a little bit of theater, but again, I don't think those guys were tuned in to these type of boats. So it's, you know, I understand how that might have happened.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it was that kind of a situation. They were, but, you know, between Captain Tabernacle and Meckling, you know, they had this really bad rivalry, and some of the words that were exchanged aren't even repeatable. But at any rate, I think Tabernacle was in the right, trying to get headquarters to react.
Well,
That
apparently he
there was
knew
a
it was an
problem
accident
here.
waiting to happen, and he was right.
He was right,
Right,
at
but-
the tail end.
So on that score, I think as the Coast Guard has reorganized over the years and become more integrated, you know, at one time when I first started, the Marine Inspection Office was very separate from a lot of other activities, including the captain of the port, you know, the authority to hold ships in ports. So, and they didn't talk to each other much. Now, if we were going to look at a vessel that was suspect in more modern times, those two officers are merged. One person has all the authorities at the top, and you could go down there in a uniform with a few people, introduce yourself, say who you are, and go through the boat, and then decide that you have to make a determination that it's unseaworthy. We have a sample letter that you write, and then they put a captain of the port order on the boat, so they could have. Now there's a way to look at a situation like that and perhaps prevent the vessel going out. And that was not the case in this time. But I want to just highlight that it's partially because of how the Coast Guard was organized. For instance, the film of the Coast Guard, oh, the Coast Guard's been on the boat before. Well, those aren't Marine inspectors. Those are the guys from the small boat station. And in those days, the small boat station didn't talk to the Marine Inspection Office, and the small boat station guys were doing courtesy boardings, but they weren't doing it at the direction of the Marine Inspection Office, looking for risky vessels. So this is the lawyer in the theater again, yep, they proved their point, but if you know the organization, that was a completely disconnected, operation. So things are different now. We might have, the Coast Guard might be able to react in a more unified way to stop something that looks like it's not right.
And the changes in the Coast Guard organization have only been tightening up in the last 10 years. The Coast Guard now has if you go to Baltimore, you don't have a Marine Safety Office. You don't have a Group Baltimore anymore. You have what's called a sector. And the sector is under one commander, and he handles both marine safety situations and also law enforcement, maritime law enforcement, and search and rescue. It's all under one roof now. So it is a better organization for carrying out Coast Guard mission.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it's an overloaded situation too. The Coast Guard gets assigned all of these, well, let the Coast Guard do it, make them, they get assigned all these responsibilities, but they don't get the resources, they don't get the funding and all that sort of thing. I mean, for instance, we have all these licensing requirements are in effect right now, but I'll guarantee you that probably 35% of the people that have six-pack licenses aren't qualified to have one. It's so easy to get one. Do you really have to do everything they say they do? I mean, there's a lot of guys running around with six-packs out there that I look at them and I say, that guy shouldn't be operating a boat.
Well, I like to say that the Coast Guard has been given tasks over the years, over the decades, and does the job well enough to keep the job. Right? Nobody else wants to do it. If you think about the different consolidation of different components of the Coast Guard, there's a couple of major consolidations over the years. 1915 is a big year, the life-saving service and the revenue cutter service coming. But I mean, the deal is we're doing all this stuff, and you're right, the budget's never enough.
No.
Right?
No, because Congress themselves really has no idea what the Coast Guard does, most of them. They're handled by a very small committee. It handles Coast Guard affairs. It's not under the Department of Defense. It's under the Homeland Security. And we had a champion in the old days, a guy named Claiborne Pell, who was the senator from Rhode Island, and he was a World War II Coast Guard veteran and served in Congress, and we had at least people knew, what they do. But the Congress, every time they add more jobs onto it, the Coast Guard tries to shed jobs too. For instance, so many of the responsibilities that only the Coast Guard used to do, inspections and things like that of small boats, they've turned over to local police departments and gotten rid of that responsibility, keep trying to narrow that side down. I mean, we've turned so much of that over to local authorities and given them the authority to issue tickets and to go, and the Coast Guard Auxiliary in itself fills in also by going around checking life jackets and so forth, which the Coast Guard was exclusively used to have to do in the old days.
So on the safety side, since I see at least one T-boat operator that I know in the audience, one of my other jobs was I was the chief of inspection in Baltimore in the mid-'90s. So I know Tommy Ireland and his boat Patience, and he could tell you the difference between inspected and not inspected, right? So there's a whole process. So if we think about the Marvel and we analogize a little bit to Victory Chimes, both those boats the regulations are for boats 100 gross tons and less, but both of those boats are over 100 gross tons. They're closer to 200 gross tons. That's still way below the 700 gross ton number that was originally in the reg book. But there are a few vessels like that the tonnage is over 200, but there's some place in the big ship passenger vessel rules that says if these are not the right rules, use the rules that make the most sense. So Victory Chimes is certificated as a T-boat. Levin J Marvel would have been certificated as a T-boat. The master would have had to have a 200-ton license instead of a 100-ton license. But, and let's be clear about that, regulating the vessel doesn't prevent the accident. Regulating the vessel might improve the survivability of the vessel when everything goes bad out there. And anybody I've been sailing on the bay for 30 years. I just made that same trip in a 17-foot sailboat. Well, you've got to be paying attention to a few things. Make sure the ships aren't coming down the channel in the fog when you decide you want to cross. So the regulation doesn't prevent the casualty. All right, so if we look at what would the Marvel have had to have, if the vessel is new, it goes through a whole plan review process. So you can't even certificate a boat without it being structurally built to standards. Biggest problem that the Coast Guard had June 1st of 1958 was how to deal with all the existing vessels that were out there that were already carrying passengers. So there's a navigation and inspection circular 4-57 that was published, which basically gave every officer in charge of marine inspection the ability to be flexible with the new regulations and apply as many as they could to the existing vessels, because you can't retrofit everything. So now let's look at what would be different about the Levin J Marvel if it was inspected. A boat that size, over 65 feet, would have to have watertight subdivision, which that boat doesn't have. And watertight bulkheads are a damage stability, survivability thing. In other words, if you hold one compartment, the boat doesn't sink.
And lifeboat.
It founders to the deck, but everybody stays on the boat, right? The whole idea is to stay out of the water. So if the boat's inspected, it would need watertight bulkheads. All of those openings below the main deck, all those portholes, right? And they're big portholes, right? You said 14-inch, that's a big porthole. I think it would have been hard for the diver to swim that up to the surface, regardless of what he said. But those are down flooding points. Everything's good when the weather's calm out there, but all of you that have been on the bay, I'm sure if I said how many people have a boat, every hand would go up. When the wind kicks up the fetch, kicks up the seas out there, it's a short, steep chop. That doesn't happen every place. So
Yeah, particularly with this area where she went down, the shallow water
yeah,
doubles it even more. And
Well, you talked about the boats
those
going
seas
up.
were coming all the way from Kent Island all the way down, or all the way down the bay. You know, that's a lot of fetch. But
so watertight subdivision, openings below the main deck are not allowed, but can be grandfathered because the Victory Chimes didn't have watertight subdivision and had those same portholes, and she never sank.
and then life rafts and
Well,
all that
the
sort of
Coast
thing.
Guard would have specified firefighting equipment minimums. Life-saving would have been more than life jackets, right? So there might have been something else that the captain would have been able to work with. And the most important thing, and we also would have specified manning. You didn't really discuss that. So he basically only had one deckhand on there. And regardless of the donkey engine and the easy putting up sails and all that stuff, that's all good when things are good. Now, when he decided, and it wasn't so unreasonable, that he was going to have an east or northeast wind, and if he could make one tack, I mean, all we got to do is pull out a chart and look at the compass rose. If he could make one tack, he should have made someplace. But he didn't because he couldn't keep sail up. It's not clear whether they got blown off, he took them down. Nobody's talked about reefing, but if he got at least one sail on the headgear, one jib, and the spanker, that should have been enough. It was a big, heavy boat. And what did the weather forecast say? 15 to 25, even though it was going to be gale force later, but Southern Bay, not for the Northern Bay. So if I was him in that big, heavy boat, even though it doesn't go to windward, and I have a boat without a jib, so it doesn't go to windward, but he probably figured he had a good shot at it and could get across. Now, once he couldn't keep sail up, on a modern boat, if you can't keep the sail up, you have an engine. But you got to have a strong enough engine to deal with the sea state. What's he got? The yawl boat that only works once in a while. So he's got no backup. So there is a point, and that it's obvious to everybody, all the boat could do is run with the seaway, right? So manning's an issue. So the manning part for me is, what happened with the sails, and how many guys did you have help that knew what they were doing. Could they douse sail? Could they reef? Could they douse sail? Could they get her in a different configuration while everything was going on? It wasn't calm out there. So the most important thing, though, that I think the Coast Guard contributes is once the vessel's under the umbrella of Coast Guard certification, it has to be hauled down and inspected on a regular basis. And that forces people to make repairs. And I'll just, the positive example I can think of, in the 1990s when oysters went through that whole period of disease and everything, the skipjacks, the remaining skipjacks, most of them are in the northern bay here. Well, we got together with them and we got most of them certificated to carry passengers. They would oyster in the winter, or dredge as they say, right? But they would use the boat for something else instead of, if you ever go down to Deal Island and you see the skipjacks come in after the winter, they just tie them up and that's how they look until they decide to fix them right before the oyster season again. So most of the boats that are around, instead of being black and white pictures in a book, are still operating, right? And I think that's important. So if you look at the boat on a regular basis, it's got to be structurally sound, right? We've had a couple other accidents in the bay since this one. Anybody who's got a charter boat knows about the El Toro 2, right? That's another boat. It was a wood boat. It was about maintenance. It was about keeping it up.
I think it's interesting to note too, if you probably check it out. I might be right on this, but when Herman Nuss started this back in '46, was it, Kathy? 46, 47, right after the war. He operated himself, and he didn't have any licenses either. He wasn't a licensed skipper, but he normally carried one of the captain's old-timers that had sailed these boats for years. They didn't have licenses either, but they had the experience. When we sailed, sometimes we had an old captain used to sail with us, Captain Bob Shores, was down from Deal somewhere, and he would sail for us a week. There was another guy that we used to have named Mooney, and he would sail with us. And as I mentioned to you last night, we were discussing, these are not, these boats don't go fast. They're not speed boats. It's 2, 3, 4 knots if you're lucky. If the wind is up, you're barely moving, you're drifting. There were square barges. There's nothing complicated. If anybody knew anything about sailing, almost anybody could have sailed one. And as a matter of fact, the Jenny D. Bell, which was the last of the 3 masters in operation on the bay, was operated by Clarence Heath and his wife. They were almost both in their 80s, and they had 5 dogs, and they had a crew member, and they sailed everywhere. They sailed from Norfolk to Baltimore hauling slag and fertilizer and lumber, whatever they could get. And if weather got bad, they just duck in somewhere and ride it out and back out again. And so it wasn't like sailing on a boat and you've got to real quickly tack and come about and the boat's changing and so forth. It's just everything was very, very, very slow. They were just big square barges with a flat bottom on it.
It's important to look at the fact that the boat can be perfectly seaworthy, inspected with the right documentation and the right safety equipment on there, and you can have a licensed master. But that doesn't mean you're not going to have a casualty. Because it all boils down to human error in the long run. And even if you have a broken part on a boat, the engine breaks or something, you've got to have that human input to make it back to port. So you have to have a combination of the right person, with the right knowledge, and a vessel in the right condition to have a safe trip.
Yeah, well, John had some experience. He had the Harry Allball, which was a skipjack that he'd sailed around the bay for over a year, just for pleasure and his own experience. And he'd sailed with Nuss before, so he had some experience. He was also, everybody says, well, he was in the Coast Guard in World War II. He was, but he was a cook. So that doesn't give you a lot of.
That explains the good crab cakes.
So you're right. You can have all the regulations in the world and everything else. You can have a skipper. I mean, it's the accidents. Accidents happen under the most qualified captains, like the Titanic, and I mean, you name it. It does happen. An anatomy of an accident. A lot of times, it's money driven. You know, a lot of people say, well, you know, when he was tied up in Cambridge and everything was nice and safe, why didn't he just take the passengers and put them on a bus and send them back to Annapolis and say, hey, we're calling it quits, go home? And obviously the reason was his money, because he, you know, he's hanging on by a string. That's why he wanted to sell the boat, and that's why I was talking to the consortium to buy it. So a lot of times it's money driven, some of these decisions, and it has nothing to do with what the Coast Guard does or inspections or anything else. You know, it's is what it is. But the Marvel kicked it off. It really made the point to Congress that it was time for regulation, and as I think you put it excellently, you know, 14 people gave their lives so that thousands and thousands of other people could live.